Well, we're so happy to have Elise Leduc, who's a coastal scientist with experience in coastal environmental management, climate change, and sea level rise planning, wetland delineation and restoration, and geospatial analysis. Elise earned a master's in environmental management from Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment, where she studied coastal environmental management, geospatial analysis, and wetland ecology and restoration. She's a certified professional wetland scientist and a Massachusetts EOEEA Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program provider. She has managed climate change vulnerability assessments and resiliency planning projects for Massachusetts coastal communities, Massachusetts coastal municipalities, She is also experienced in ecological field studies, including conducting eelgrass, shellfish, and aquatic macroinvertebrate studies and wetland delineations and evaluations, and has provided guidance for various wetland restoration projects such as thin layer deposition salt marsh restoration in Rhode Island, various estuary restoration projects in conjunction with culvert redesigns, and the ecological modeling and adaptive management approach to support the Herring River Estuary Restoration Project on the Outer Cape. So please join me in welcoming Elise.
Thank you very much. So it was a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Mary. For those of you who are unfamiliar with my company, Woodsole Group is an environmental consulting company. We were located in Falmouth for decades. We recently relocated to Bourne, but we're still doing all the same interesting coastal planning, coastal restoration, municipal planning for climate change work that we've been doing for years. And today I'm going to share with you an example of a local climate change resiliency building project using flexible adaptation pathways from an example in Falmouth. Just a little bit of background, because I'm not sure what the background of the audience is here today. A little bit of background on climate change, what's happening and why. Increasing concentrations of heat-trapping greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, are primarily responsible for climate change that has been observed since the industrial era. The Earth's climate is the way it is because we have greenhouse gases. A little bit of greenhouse gases is what keeps it warm enough for us to live and be comfortable on Earth. Too much greenhouse gases and too much heat starts to get trapped. And even just switching the average temperature of the Earth by a couple degrees can have far-ranging effects. And what we're seeing is, as we're seeing these temperatures increase, we're also seeing incredible increases in carbon dioxide. This is a graph of carbon dioxide concentrations in parts per million back 1,000 years. And as you can see, for most of that time period, it never exceeded 290 parts per million until the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1800s, at which point those concentrations of carbon dioxide have spiked. In the recent years, these are actually measured very specifically at the Mauna Loa station in Hawaii, and the most recent measurement that I could find from just last month, we're higher than 412 parts per million right now, and there's no indication that that's going to go down anytime soon. Increasing that carbon dioxide, increasing that heat trapping ability of the atmosphere has caused increasing temperatures worldwide, both on the surface of the land as well as the surface of the ocean. That figure in the lower left basically shows anything in orange has been getting warmer compared to average, and the darker the orange, the more warm it has gotten. And this warming has caused not only our temperatures to increase, but it's causing warmer oceans. Thermal expansion in and of itself will actually cause sea level rise, in addition to melting ice caps, which will contribute further to sea level rise in the future. Depending what climate change scenario you look at, there's low, intermediate, high, extreme sea level rise scenarios. For the purposes of statewide planning, Woodsole Group has been working with Mass DOT and other state agencies. We're relying at this point on the high sea level rise and climate change projection, which for Vineyard Sound in the area of Falmouth puts the mean high water elevation in the year 2070 at 5.3 feet, which is about 4.5 feet higher than it is right now. And that would be sort of the medium blue bar graph that you see here on the lower right. By 2100, that could be more than 7 feet of sea level rise. So what are coastal communities supposed to do with this information? With communities such as Falmouth, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Cape Cod geography, there's a map of Massachusetts here. Falmouth is located in the southwestern corner of Cape Cod, and this study is focused on the surf drive area of Falmouth, which is the southern shoreline near Woods Hole. Falmouth looked at this climate change information and looked at the fact that it has more than 70 miles of coastline if you consider all of its bays and inlets, and decided that it really needed to assess its vulnerability to climate change and to flooding due to climate change. So in 2018, it contracted the Woods Hole Group to complete a town-wide climate change flood vulnerability assessment. And during that assessment, we identified the surf drive area as one of the most at-risk areas in town. That study focused mostly on municipal infrastructure, but the town was also concerned with protecting and enhancing resiliency to natural habitats, as well as looking at private buildings and residences as well. To look at this in more detail, the town of Falmouth actually applied for and received a state-funded MVP action grant through the state's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. But when you're thinking about resiliency planning, every community is different, and if you come up with a plan of action that doesn't resonate with the community, it's unlikely to be implemented. So we knew very early on that we really needed to engage the town staff, town committee members, and residents to hear from them what their goals were in order to really make this an effective plan. So we did this through a series of steering committee meetings with town staff and committee members, department-specific interviews to really understand the workings of the assets that are there today. We had a large public workshop back in December 2019 with more than 150 attendees to really hear from them what their thoughts and goals and what they saw as the problem areas and opportunities for this area were, as well as we issued a public survey that we received 104 responses from that really dug a little bit deeper into specifics about what the public was thinking. From those interactions, we pulled out 4 major goals that we were hearing from the community, and they were to preserve, restore, and enhance the coastal ecosystems and to improve resiliency and ecosystem functions, improve the resiliency of infrastructure to protect operational capacity, maintain important public access, transportation corridors, and utility line connections, and to balance the use, access, and enjoyment of coastal resources while at the same time accounting for shifts in response to sea level rise and encouraging adaptability. So how do we achieve those goals? In this case, we relied on a dynamic adaptation pathways approach to help build coastal resiliency in the surf drive area. And we did this through a 6-step process. And I'm going to go through each of these 6 steps for you today. So the first is to identify the problem. In this case, we knew from our original study that the surf drive area was going to face a series of coastal hazards. Our study was largely focused on flooding, but we did feel it was important to address coastal erosion as well. But it will be impacted by 2 types of flooding. So daily high tide flooding, sometimes called nuisance flooding, due to sea level rise as we move forward into the future, as well as storm surge inundation, which is already a significant problem today, but will become increasingly so in the future, and coastal erosion. For the daily high tide flooding, we took those sea level rise predictions on the future mean high water elevation and compared that to the elevations on the ground today to get an understanding of how much of this area would be impacted by that daily flooding in the future, and to just zoom into a section to give you a little bit more information about the level of detail we were looking at. We were able to pull out sections of roadway, parking areas, and sections of neighborhood that would be likely inundated just during regular daily high tide flooding in the future due to sea level rise to help us start prioritizing areas for change and adaptation. That second type of flooding I was talking about is storm surge inundation. The Woods Hole Group has completed a statewide modeling effort for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation that looks at the probability of inundation of any particular area on the Massachusetts coast during a storm based on different storm level intensities. So we have data from present day up through 2100 looking at not only the extent of flooding, but the probability that that area will flood in a given year, and also, although not shown in these graphics, the depth of that flooding as we move forward. So we have this series of figures that I'll show you as we click through time. The darker blues are a more likely chance of flooding, 100 to 50% chance annually, moving through the purples, greens, and yellows. By the time you get to the pinks, that's a very low chance of flooding during a storm in any given year. So this would be the present day, 2030, 2050, and 2070. And you can see how those colors change. The probabilities of inundation increase, the areas of inundation increases, and also the depth of inundation increases. So we were able to look at this data, look at that elevations of flooding, and help us plan our adaptation actions accordingly. And then finally, coastal erosion as one of the problems facing this area. Like, as I mentioned, this was a flood-specific study, but with many of these assets sitting right on the shoreline in an area that has historic erosion, we felt we would be remiss if we didn't address it a little bit. So we did pull from the Massachusetts CZM shoreline change project data, and in their long-term shoreline change rates, which draw from shoreline position data from the mid-1800s to 2009, the average erosion rate for this entire study area is approximately 0.4 feet per year. The next step in the process was to identify the key assets in this area. So really asking yourself, what are the features that we need to address? What are the features that we want to protect, preserve, or adapt moving forward? And those assets range from roadways, such as Surf Drive itself, which is a really low-lying coastal road, as you can see in the upper left, to the Shining Sea Bikeway and various parking lots, to utility infrastructure, such as the Trunk River Sewer Main, which services all of Woods Hole Village, Surf Drive Pump Station, which helps serve the sewer system of an entire neighborhood, as well as other major utilities such as electrical substations, town buildings such as the Mitchell Bathhouse, and natural resources throughout this area, including coastal ponds, barrier beaches and dunes, and other salt marshes and other wetlands. To better understand the existing conditions of all of these assets, we did do a site walk, as well as having detailed department-specific interviews to get more information from folks, such as how often is maintenance required? Is there redundancy in the system? And perhaps most importantly, what would you be willing to change? And what would you be unwilling to change? What is something that we have to keep the way it is now in order to maintain those functions? Once we determined the risks and the vulnerabilities to the key assets within our study area, our next step was to develop a full suite of potential adaptation actions to help reduce or eliminate those vulnerabilities in the future. We did this by developing 4 major themes based on those community goals that we heard during our outreach efforts. The 4 themes that we developed were natural resources, which emphasized ecosystem health and resilience; protection, which emphasized protection and maintenance of existing infrastructure; connection, emphasizing maintenance of vital access, transportation, and utility corridors; and managed retreat, emphasizing a balance of uses now with the increased costs and risks in the future through a multi-phase retreat plan. And for all of these, a series of potential actions was identified under each theme for each asset. And I would point out at this point that in order to aid in communication of these results and the overall process, we did come up with a color coding system and a set of icons to help carry forth the idea of each of these themes throughout all of our reporting, maps, and documentation. So you'll see these colors, green, orange, purple, and blue, repeated throughout the presentation. When coming up with these potential actions, we pulled them together in 2 different ways. We can look at them by asset-specific lists or by theme, looking at all of the assets together. An example of what this might look like when we look at the options for a specific asset, here I have an example of the Surf Drive roadway itself, just along the barrier beach, with actions ranging from protecting it with beach and dune nourishment, planning for and ultimately implementing a phased retreat and removal of that roadway to revert to a natural barrier beach system, to constructing some kind of a protection structure, whether that's a revetment or a seawall, to keep it in place. With each of these actions, we proposed an estimated time frame. These are all based on water levels projected out using a high sea level rise scenario and at what time frame each action would be necessary. But I'm going to focus to the rest of my presentation on the themed approach, so we can look at all of the assets and actions together within a single theme, and then I'll bring it all together at the end with what we finally recommended. So the first theme, natural resources. For all of these, we did come up with short, mid, and long-term sets of actions. Short-term being in the 2030 timeframe, mid-term being the 2050 timeframe, and long-term being the 2070 timeframe. And in this case, you can see that there are actions for various assets, all needing to happen at the same time if you were going to implement a natural resources only theme for the surf drive area. This includes beginning studies and plannings for phasing out services to roadways, moving sewer mains, doing some targeted beach and dune nourishment to protect key pieces of infrastructure today, as well as elevating and flood-proofing some of the necessary sewer infrastructure close to the beach, and starting to think about how to address flooding all the way back at Town Hall, which does flood through Fresh River and Sitter's Pond as part of this system. In the midterm, some major actions would need to start happening in order to keep, to really realize all those goals that the town had. The sewer main would need to be relocated along Woods Hole Road and Oyster Pond Road. Part of the bikeway would need to be relocated away from the shoreline and portions of it elevated up on a boardwalk. The roadway itself, services and utilities and maintenance would cease. If it was damaged in a storm, the pavement would be removed and not replaced. Other structures such as culverts and groins would be removed. Prepping for transitioning to a natural barrier beach system. And some of the low-lying neighborhoods with significant number of residences at high risk of flooding could be protected through nature-based solutions such as living shorelines and raised earthen berms. And by 2070, the picture for this area really starts to look more natural, where you'd have abandoned the surf drive roadway along the barrier beach. These two coastal ponds, due to elevated water levels, would actually potentially connect into a larger salt marsh estuary, and the living shoreline earthen berm that was used to protect the low-lying neighborhood may have to be enhanced in elevation. And just to give a little bit of an idea of what some of these solutions might look like in practice, the potential action to relocate a portion of the bikeway along Oyster Pond Road. This is what the roadway looks like today. And we could envision something where a bike lane could be added beside the roadway, using existing space, but moving that bikeway away from its vulnerable location immediately on the shoreline as it is today. The action to potentially protect low-lying residential neighborhoods with living shorelines. This would require construction of some elevated earthen berm type structure that could be vegetated with natural coastal vegetation. Looking at the elevations projected for mean high water out to 2070, and potentially wanting to protect homes from some small storm surge as well. In some cases, that earthen berm could fit with the existing space between buildings and, in this case, the Fresh River Inlet. But in other cases, the homes are already so close that in order to reach the elevation needed for the earthen berm, its total footprint on the ground would be big enough that it would encroach in the space currently occupied by the buildings. Those buildings would, if wanting to keep them in place, would need to be elevated, and the earthen berm and the building could sort of coexist in the same footprint. But this would help provide protection to more than 150 homes that are in dire risk of flooding in the future. And then finally, sort of a look at what the overall picture could look like under this natural resources theme. Currently, you can see there's a paved roadway along the entire barrier beach, a series of groins. You probably can't even see it. There's a really small culvert that goes into this large salt pond. There's a causeway where the bikeway currently sits that's separating two wetland areas. In the future, you could imagine that if we undeveloped it, you'd have a natural barrier beach and dune system, a natural open inlet. The bikeway could be elevated up on a boardwalk, letting these two wetland areas connect, and then ultimately relocating the rest of the bikeway path along other existing roadways back from the beachfront. So that was the natural resources theme. We can do the same process with the other themes that we considered. So in this case, the protection theme, again, we go through short, mid, and long-term potential actions for the surf drive area. In the short term, some initial protections that would need to happen to make sure that the bikeway and most importantly, the sewer main are protected from storm damage and flooding, and elevating and flood-proofing the bathhouse in this location. In the midterm, actually elevating and protecting the roadway with a revetment, or keeping it at grade and protecting it with a seawall, and implementing tidal controls on some of these current inlets to eliminate flooding that would happen in the back areas, even if this wall was put in place. You'll notice in the protection scenario, very little is needed farther back in the system because this wall of the roadway essentially protects everything behind it. And then finally, potentially needing to increase the elevation of the road or flood barrier as you move forward with this protection scenario. And just as with the natural resources potential actions, to bring some of these a little bit more illustratively forward, if you were going to elevate Surf Drive and protect the seaward side of it with a stone revetment, this gives you an idea of the existing elevation of the roadway today. It's currently at about 4 feet, NAVD 88. That means that by 2070, the mean high water would just wash completely over the barrier beach every high tide. You could think about elevating in 2 different ways. You could elevate with the intent on keeping the roadway above mean high water so that you don't experience that daily high tide flooding. Or you could elevate with the purpose of protecting from some storm surge elevation as well, in which case this becomes a much more massive structure, but would be much more protective to everything behind it. Considerations with this is that it does take up the beach and dune system, and you do lose those natural resources on the front side if something like this were implemented. Another consideration was to maintain Surf Drive at its existing grade and install a seawall of some kind to protect from flooding. Again, you can consider this as something to protect from daily high tide flooding only, or something much larger to protect from storm surge. And you'll note that this seems a little crazy when you think about it, but we did want to consider all alternatives. This would certainly disconnect the community from the beachfront. Aesthetically, there's probably issues here. But there are some folks who think protection is the way to go. So we did consider all options. And then third, we have the theme of connection. This was, again, to keep everything, keep all that access, the roadway access, the access to infrastructure and utilities functioning to the extent possible. Again, we have short, medium, and long-term proposed actions under this theme. This would include in the short term some improved maintenance of the roadway to keep it functioning as is in the short term. Keeping the sewer main in place but burying it to a greater depth so that it isn't destroyed or damaged during a storm, wave action, and erosion. Transitioning the bathhouse to portable facilities that would still provide those same services but could be removed prior to a major storm event, and elevating or floodproofing the sewer pump station at the beach parking lot. In the midterm, actually replacing the existing roadway with a long extended bridge. For anyone who's visited the Florida Keys, something similar to that. This would be almost a mile of extended bridge, elevating the bikeway on a boardwalk, relocating the rest of it to Oyster Pond Road, and starting to elevate portions of Mill Road and Surf Drive in front of this residential neighborhood that in that aspect could protect not only the access along the roadway, but the houses behind it. And again, that would come with tidal controls on the inlet so that flooding doesn't just happen from the backside of the beach. And then finally, there are some electrical substations that would need to be relocated to higher ground because where they are today is likely to be inundated during daily mean high tide on a regular basis. This idea of replacing the road with an elevated bridge due to engineering practices and wanting to be above flood elevations. If you were to do this today, the proposed roadway would likely be at an elevation of approximately 19 feet. This is significantly higher than the roadway at 4 feet as it is today. This might cause some aesthetic issues, but it would allow natural habitat to develop under and below the bridge. And in terms of replacing a section with the bikeway with an elevated boardwalk, this is something that's been actually implemented in other locations. This is a section of bikeway by Coast Guard Beach in Eastham that is up on a boardwalk. I think it's quite lovely, and in many cases can allow the salt marsh habitat to establish under and through and around the boardwalk as well. And then finally, the fourth theme that we considered was a managed retreat theme. And again, we have short, mid, and long-term actions for this. This one probably has the most dramatic impact to residential neighborhoods and potential changes in that aspect. And very early on, lots of planning, research, and studies were recommended. If this was something the town wanted to pursue, you'd need to start thinking about buyouts or regulatory changes that would prohibit folks from rebuilding if houses were damaged, beginning studies to relocate the sewer main, and starting to do public outreach to really let folks know that some major future changes will be necessary to accommodate sea level rise in the future. In the midterm, there's a section of this residential neighborhood, if you remember back to that daily high tide flooding map I showed you in the beginning, that's likely to flood on a regular basis that we're proposing under this scenario could start to transition to what we're calling a waterfront park, which I'll show you in just a second. Some of these electrical substations would need to be relocated. Services and utilities would be stopped along the barrier beach. Water mains would be abandoned. Surf drive would no longer be maintained. And a portion of the bikeway would be abandoned according to this approach. And in the long term, you'd end up with natural barrier beach, the pavement removed. Again, these two ponds would likely connect due to elevated water levels. And this waterfront park that we've envisioned would increase in size and basically become a new recreational feature to this area. And other portions of Surf Drive and Mill Road would no longer be functional or passable. To bring this waterfront park forward just a little bit, this would involve a phased retreat of that low-lying residential neighborhood, transitioning to what could be a kind of exciting feature. Obviously, there could be a lot of pushback from residents, but I like to think whenever there's a major loss of some feature to the town due to climate change planning, that you can try to think of what benefit you could create in its stead. In this case, we envision something where you could have a new tidal water body, some boardwalks and paths, an observation pier or deck, and a new parking area that could replace the existing one that would allow folks continued access to the beachfront. And in the long term, that could expand as new areas start to be inundated by high tide. You could include sort of a high spot with a picnic pavilion, a boardwalk that would get you out to the barrier beach, similar to what they have at Town Neck Beach and Sandwich today, a kayak launch, and you could even incorporate a small earthen berm along one side so that areas that were set to be flooded by high tide in the future could be protected, and you're minimizing the amount of flooding to just the area of the park. So once we had that full set of options, we had to assess the efficacy of those actions. We had to determine which ones made the most sense for the town. And we did this looking at a number of different factors. We looked at the estimated cost to implement some of these actions, the target effects or benefits that could be gained by putting some of these actions into effect, and any adverse impacts or negative things that would happen if the action was implemented. And again, these are just some examples, tables for the surf drive along the barrier beach roadway actions. We looked at the costs, some of the target effects, and the adverse impacts. We did this for every asset. I won't show them all for you here. This was another table for the Shining Sea Bikeway, looking at the comparison of the costs, the target effects, and the adverse impacts. And really, the goal was to get to this. The next step here is to develop implementation pathways, also called dynamic adaptation pathways, which can provide a really unique visualization of how all these assets fit together with each other, with timeframes, and with potential sea level rise estimates. And these figures can be a little confusing when you first look at them, but ultimately these can be incredibly useful to town planners and managers as they start to move forward with decision making. So I'm going to walk you through how to read one of these and then show you a couple examples. Each action is listed down the left-hand side for a particular asset. In this case, again, this is the Surf Drive roadway along the barrier beach. Each action is color-coded, whether it's a connection, managed retreat, natural resources, or protection themed action. And then a couple other symbols to note. These little black circles represent points where you can change paths. So perhaps you started down one pathway and want to switch to another one in the future. Those are points where it might be more natural to do so. And then there are other places where you see these vertical black bars called adaptation tipping points. These are points at which an adaptation is no longer meeting its goals. So for instance, here, if you were to engage in improved maintenance to keep the Surf Drive roadway passable, there's going to come a point approximately 2050 down here where that's no longer going to be useful, because just maintaining the road, you're still going to flood at a regular interval with high tide flooding. In some cases, the first purpose of that action might cease, but could transition to another action function in the future. So for instance, if you were originally going to build the roadway up to an elevation to protect from storm surge flooding, that would work for quite some time until you get to a certain level of sea level rise, where you might only be protecting from daily mean high tide flooding in the future, because so many even minor storms are going to overtop that roadway anyway. And then I would draw your attention to the bottom couple lines of these figures. There is a bar that shows levels of sea level rise in 1 foot increments. So we do have that tied to two different climate change scenarios, sort of a high and an intermediate, and what out years those levels of sea level rise are expected to be reached. This can allow a town to say, okay, if we need to do something at approximately 2.5 feet of sea level rise, that could happen somewhere between 2060 and 2050, depending on what climate change scenario we're thinking about. But it also lets them monitor sea level rise moving forward and adjust those timelines accordingly as things either change slower or faster than we're currently projecting. So I did walk through this figure a little bit already. This is just the same figure blown up a little bit more for the surf drive area. The other thing that's on here is that red dotted line, which shows our preferred or recommended option for this scenario. In this case, current actions will get the town to approximately 2030 before the roadway starts to need more protection or need an adaptation to allow folks to continue driving on it. And in this case, we're recommending a short-term action of protecting the roadway with beach and dune nourishment, while also engaging in public outreach and policy changes that would allow for cessation of road maintenance and ultimately removal of the road in the long term. So here we have at approximately the 2050 timeline that they would stop maintenance on the road. The road could stay for the time being, but they didn't want, the idea is to not sink any more cost into something that won't be there in the long term. If it is damaged during a storm, the pavement could be removed earlier, but if not, we're recommending removal of the pavement and reverting to a natural barrier beach by 2070 in the case of the portion of the roadway along the barrier beach. With each of these dynamic adaptation pathways, we have what we call a pathway scorecard. This lets you take each of the actions. So if you were to stay just on a blue path or just on an orange path, what are the relative costs, target effects, and side effects? And then we have some examples of combining those paths together, including our preferred alternative. So you can see how those costs compare to some of the other alternatives and how those target effects and side effects compare to some of those other alternatives as well. We did produce these for every one of the assets we considered. I'm not going to go through them all today. This is just one other example of how we looked at the different actions for the low-lying residential neighborhood. In this case, current actions would take you to approximately 2050. So no major work has to be done until that point, but planning for what would ultimately need to happen in the 2050 timeline. In this case, we're recommending protecting that neighborhood through an elevation of the roads. And it could be done through a phased approach where it's elevated to a certain point first and then potentially a higher elevation in the future to continue keeping pace with sea level rise. And again, this not only allows continued access along those roadways, so you don't end up with a bunch of dead ends at the end of peninsular roadways, but also protection for those residential houses as well. And just like the Surf Drive asset, we did come up with this pathway scorecard for the individual path options as well as some combined path options. And this really helped determine which option was going to be the preferred path. So finally, having considered all of our many action options, looking at their efficacy, effectiveness, feasibility, and how they really needed to be implemented at certain timeframes, given different sea level rise levels, we did pull together a set of recommended alternatives for all assets, which drew from all four themes, to come up with a comprehensive phased management approach for the Surf Drive area for the town. And in this case, recommended approaches included beginning studies in the short term to relocate the sewer main, but also researching and developing policies for how to phase out town services to private homes and roads in vulnerable areas, perhaps starting to target that there's about a dozen seasonal beach cabanas on the barrier beach, targeting those properties for acquisition, which would make phasing out this roadway easier in the future, doing some targeted beach and dune nourishment to protect the roadway, and transitioning the bathhouse to portable facilities. In the midterm, some major actions would likely need to happen, including relocating the sewer main, elevating the bike path on a boardwalk, relocating portions of the bike path and parking lots, removing some of those structures along the barrier beach, ceasing maintenance of the road, and beginning that roadway elevation component for the Mill Road Surf Drive portion that does protect that low-lying neighborhood, and continuing to nourish the beach and dunes in front of the recreational beach parking lot. This roadway elevation would likely cause increased erosion due to adding that hard structure right at an already eroding coastline. So this would be necessary to maintain that recreational beach there. And then finally, in that long term, elevation might need to be enhanced along that roadway. As I described, these two ponds could connect as a larger estuary, and ultimately abandoning all pavement and roadway along the Surf Drive barrier beach, so that it becomes just a naturally migrating barrier beach. So just to put this in a bigger context, as I wrap up here, a similar evaluation and planning exercise could be done for any location. It could be scaled up to a bigger town. In fact, I think we're doing something very similar right now for all of Palm Beach. Or it could be scaled down to an even smaller area, just a set of properties even, rather than an entire neighborhood. The benefits of a dynamic adaptation pathways approach and phased implementation plans are numerous, but the few that I have here are that it allows you to develop an initial action plan based on today's goals and the most up-to-date climate projections that you can start acting on today, but also while letting you monitor water levels and environmental changes in real time and adjusting those planned timelines accordingly. You don't just stick your head in the sand and carry forward with this plan for 50 years, even if conditions change. You monitor and you adjust as data informs that. And then also allowing you to switch paths in the future if town goals, funding, or conditions do change. And then finally, I think this study was a good example of how managed retreat and restoration of natural resources in one portion of a study area can be effectively coupled with targeting protection of key infrastructure in residential neighborhoods in another part of a study area to meet the varied goals of a community. And so with that, I'll leave this up here during the portion for questions. I would also point out that for more information on this study, please visit the Town of Falmouth's webpage under the Coastal Resiliency Action Committee's page. They do have a Surf Drive planning page where they have the draft report and executive summary. There'll be a link to an ESRI story map. So there's multiple different ways to look at this data if people want to dig into it in more detail. This was certainly just a high-level overview of what we've done.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elise. That was really interesting, and I'm sure there'll be some questions. There's one already. Can residents in the flood-prone areas currently obtain affordable flood insurance for damage to their homes?
I don't know whether it's affordable. I do know that there are a number of homes in this area that do have flood insurance. There are also a number of them that choose not to get flood insurance. It's not required if they don't have a mortgage, if they own their house outright. And so some folks just determine that it's more cost effective for them to deal with the damage when it occurs than to have that flood insurance regularly.
Sure. Do you have an idea of the age of the houses?
I don't. I do know that some of them recently have been rebuilt, specifically on the Barrier Beach portion of the study area. I think almost all of them were damaged during Hurricane Bob and were rebuilt and elevated on stilts following that storm. So those are on the order of 20, 25 years. The neighborhood in the low-lying area, I don't have an idea of the ages. That none of them would be considered historical.
Does anybody have any other questions? Here we go. Sarah from the Linda Loring Foundation says, what is the current time scale for implementation? Has the phase approach already started?
So we have just completed the draft report at the end of August. I originally thought the timeline of this presentation and the town public presentation would be flipped, but I'm actually giving a very similar public presentation to the town tomorrow, and we'll be finalizing the report at the end of September. So no implementation has actually happened yet. At this point, we're still finalizing the study and receiving comments from both the town and the public on what we have presented here. But I would say to that, though, there are a number of pieces of this that if the town does choose to go forward, in order to actually implement some of these things by 2030, planning, studies, fundraising, et cetera, would need to happen soon.
I can imagine that for a lot of the homeowners, this is a really emotional conversation to have. What's that like for you as a facilitator? How do you manage all these different needs?
It can be tricky, but so far, I think overwhelmingly the town of Falmouth residents recognize that climate change is a problem and that change of some kind is necessary. Even folks, I think, especially with what we've recommended as our main approach, the folks with the largest to lose are those dozen or so owners of what I call beach cabanas. They're seasonal homes on the barrier beach. Even those folks, when they've come to meetings, they're polite. They ask their questions, and so it's easier to deal with communicating with those folks when it's civil, and so far it has been. I can imagine if folks were coming at me with pitchforks, it would be different. But I think it's something that the town is going to wrestle with all over the place. So this is just one neighborhood, and this is not the only neighborhood that looks like this in terms of flood risk. And so how much money can the town really pour into road repairs and road maintenance on a yearly basis if this is happening all along their coastline, not just at Surf Drive? So coming up with some locations where, phased retreat actually makes some sense, I think will be important. And I think that's where the long-term public outreach and education is really going to come in. And if we can help the town come up with innovative policies and sort of incentives for folks who are in those areas where we're proposing to undevelop, so it's not a lose-lose for them. Like, what benefit can we give to them in the long run? Can there be incentives for them to redevelop elsewhere in town? Can the buyouts be financially beneficial to them? So we're hoping that this isn't steamrolling anybody, and that at the time scales that we're planning for, there are decades to implement some of these things.
Great. There's a question: has public policy issues been considered in regards to funding? Who pays for what? The taxpayers and/or the impacted property owners? And are the property owners mostly commercial or are they residential?
Okay, I'm going to go backwards on that one. So the property owners are all private residential in this case. There are no commercial properties down in the area that we were looking at. There are some town-owned properties and other properties that are less developed, owned by land trusts and other organizations, but there's no commercial buildings. In terms of who pays, that's always the question. And I think at this stage in the study, there's no hard answer for that. And I would say that for some of the major infrastructure changes to the sewer main, the roadways, the bike path, those are things that the town, perhaps with the help of grants, would likely take on. But it does become an interesting question when you start talking about a specific adaptation meant to protect a residential neighborhood. And there is no final answer on that yet, but I could imagine a number of cost-sharing situations that could take place. There could be special taxing districts that over time, slight additional taxes in a certain area would accumulate enough money to actually put in that project. These are all things that will be an additional planning stage for the town in terms of the logistics of implementing some of these. This first step was really kind of big picture. What adaptations could you implement as a full suite to really improve the coastal resilience of this whole area? But cost and who pays is always an important question.
Definitely. Another question, will your recommendations include making changes to Falmouth's building codes for new structures and the renovation of existing structures?
Yeah, so specific recommendations in the study are largely to these assets specifically, but there is a section in the end of the report talking about bylaw changes, zoning changes that could help facilitate the implementation of some of these actions in the long term. So again, I think the actual wording change to some of those bylaws are outside of the scope of this particular study and will certainly be a next step, but I don't think some of the things that we're proposing are feasible under today's laws and bylaws. And so that's a first step that the town will have to engage in order to basically prepare the roadway to make some of these changes happen.
And have you been doing all of this consensus building online?
No, luckily or unluckily, I don't know how you want to think about it. All of our major public outreach actually happened pre-March. And so that it was an amazing workshop, was in December, back when you could still have 150 people in one room, and you could have folks, drawing on maps and adding stickies and actually doing everything face to face. The public survey was online, but some of the initial, interviews and meetings were all in person. Thank goodness, because online would have been a little trickier. Although I think folks are adapting, and online forums are just like this are drawing a bigger and bigger crowd. So I think we could have made it work, but I'm just happy that the timing of this happened such that we were able to have that initial workshop in person. We had hoped for a secondary workshop to present the final results, but given the COVID situation, we are opting for a virtual presentation. But we did put together a more interactive story map feature, which wasn't in our original scope, that will hopefully be more tangible for folks to sort of drive back through on their own after the presentation.
Great, and I think Mary Longacre posted a link to that in the chat, folks, for the public presentation tomorrow at 6 o'clock.
Great, thank you.
This will probably be our last question from Sam. Following up on flood insurance, can you clarify if the National Flood Insurance Program requires a homeowner to rebuild in place as opposed to relocate or rebuild in a less flood-prone area? Are there any regulatory changes that have gone into effect elsewhere in the U.S. that better facilitate a managed retreat approach, or are there any communities that you're looking to elsewhere in the country?
Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for that. What I've found, especially after Hurricane Sandy, there were a number of communities, specifically in New Jersey and maybe along Long Island, that basically looked at their existing infrastructure and thought to themselves, how can we afford to, keep maintaining this roadway? But there's all kinds of takings laws that basically says you can't just stop. The public bought a particular lot thinking they were going to have roadway and water and electric. You can't just take that away from them. So no one actually has a good roadmap for this, but there's a lot of people thinking about it right now. And I think it's going to become more and more necessary, and there will be a path forward in the not too distant future for how to start retreating. But I think you're right. Right now, flood insurance is for rebuilding on the same lot, but at an elevated or less flood prone situation, such as the presentation we just saw with elevating the buildings. It doesn't actually get you out of harm's way, it just gets you above harm's way. But in some cases, these beachfront cabanas that I'm talking about, mean high water is already underneath them. So it's not, in some cases, relocating is gonna have to be an option. So, but I don't think the National Flood Insurance.
Well, maybe Falmouth is going to be a leader for us to watch. Well, thanks. So. Thank you, Elise, and thanks everybody for your questions. Oh, Not out of, above, yeah, not out of, above harm's way. What a statement. Thank you, Elise. Yeah, exactly. I think it's all about looking at what is the goal of a particular project and how long are you thinking? What's so,
Yep.
like I said, lots of questions, some answers, and then more questions. But it's really great to see, 81 people here sitting and thinking about it.
Yeah, but those questions
Absolutely,
are what drive
absolutely.
us forward.
And
so.
if people have other questions, can they email you? Okay, great.
Oh, absolutely.
So thanks again, and everybody will see you at 11:30 for our next session. So, yep, bye-bye.